In this video, we're going to be looking at poses that are designed to target the inner legs, the groin, and what we can do to make them, again, more empowering for our students, help them tinker with variables, and how do we help them go hands-free for a more accessible, sustainable approach. We're going to be looking at poses such as squat, goddess, triangle, and an extended side angle. Now, as I did already mention, that many of these standing poses that are designed to lengthen through the inner leg muscles are going to be a lot more sustainable and a lot more activating of the body because they have to hold the body up against gravity. And you could see that when we did stuff down on the back, whereas here the legs have to hold the body up. So they are, I would consider them to be more sustainable and more accessible and more approachable ways of actually creating inner leg lengthening. So let's start by looking at goddess first and foremost. Now, one of the ways that we tend to use force in goddess is if we take the hands and then we push like this, or we twist and we twist, okay? So when we look at, again, how the body works, we want to be able to find the activation through the outside of the legs to take the body away from the midline. So one thing that you can try with your students is to get them to bring more weight to the outer edges of their feet, more weight to the pinky toes. Now, sometimes your students will turn the toes out more in hopes that it gets more external rotation, but this can actually switch off these supporting areas. Whereas when you have the toes angled forward, doesn't have to be a lot more. It can be just a hair, or it could be a lot more. When they're angled forward, it brings the ability to send more weight to the outer edges of the feet, which again activates the area that creates the action of moving the legs away from the midline. And that's really what we want. So we're not going to place the hands on the legs. We're not going to push at all. We're not going to go much lower than this kind of height here, okay? I can go here. I can go even lower. But again, this is range that generally isn't super functional, nor is it very sustainable. It's also just really not necessary for anything else other than, you know, doing a circus performance or doing certain yoga poses. So again, the ball's in your court as a teacher, and your students' court as well, and you're just giving them the information. So the weight more towards the outer edges of the feet, and this can be done by even pulsing and pressing one leg at a time, bringing the weight towards the outer edges of the feet. Now, if you want to add the twist, here, wrapping the arms around, here, wrapping the arms around, it can really be opening up and then whoosh, into the twist. Opening up and into the twist. When we push and we push, again, we are just creating overly lengthened tendons and ligaments because the muscles that are required to bring the body into that twist, they're not being used. We're using external force instead of internal strength, and we're putting the body at risk in doing so. Next, we're going to look at a triangle pose. Now, even if we get our students to use the block, which is generally what we do, I have mentioned this quite a few times already, the resting on the block creates your students' ability to force their flexibility. And what we can do instead is just take the hand off the block. Just like we explored in a lot of the other poses where gravity is really at play, we want to encourage our students to lift out of the tendency to collapse into something like this. So you might even cue them to move the hips so that they can come all the way down. But if we're looking at what is going to support the body here, we want to be able to lift out of it and really lengthen and extend out of the waist. Now, this isn't super focused on let's activate the glutes to be able to get into this type of pose. However, it does help because we're going again for that resistance. We are lifting up against gravity instead of letting the body drop down. So that's why we're not aiming to touch the floor. And even if I have students that can touch the floor, I will often cue them and tell them that they want to feel and they want to create the energy that they're trying to touch the floor, but they can't because everything else is lifting them up. So there's the extension through the wingspan. However, they're lifting away from that. They're not trying to drop down. There is that lift. And as I mentioned before, in most cases, going beyond kind of this point isn't really super beneficial. So the benefits do not accumulate in the body the moment that your student touches the floor or touches a block or gets their body down a certain level, okay? So it's just really about getting them to lift out, getting them to feel where that spaciousness is, and being able to maintain that spaciousness to then create the support that will create the release and the willing lengthening of the tissues. Now, when we look at something like an extended side angle, it has some similar components to triangle pose. However, we are bending into this knee. Now, you probably know what I'm going to say is that we are not going to rest the body weight down. We are not going to pop the hand on the floor. We're going to lift away from that. Now, I'm going to get into more of the dynamics of this type of position when we do our floor poses that focus on groin lengthening, such as happy baby. Essentially, this is like a happy baby position, right? Except for we've got a few different angles and ways that gravity is playing on the body. But when your students come into this, just encourage them to play around with the hands-free variation. So instead of resting the elbow on the thigh, they're lifting away. And you can use that compare and contrast. Now, when they lift away, there is much more of an organic recruitment of the muscles that are required to support the weight of the body while maintaining the action of this external rotation here. So just like we did in Goddess, encourage your students to bring the weight to the outer edge of the foot. And these toes, again, same thing as in Goddess. You might have your students really turning the toes out in hopes that it brings this type of positioning. But what often happens is this kind of goes a little bit passive, not to mention the strain that this can put on the knee. So you might find that when they curve their toes in slightly, they can get just a little bit more activation through here, which naturally supports the release through here. So whether you have a student that tends to rest the elbow on the thigh or tends to rest the hand down or really plants and then uses that, this position should really be able to be achieved here. Okay, so again, these are some compare and contrast methods that you can utilize. You can even use a bit of a basic preparation, which is to press down and draw that leg up, to press down and draw the leg up. That position and that angle, as I said, is very similar to a happy baby, which we're going to get into in the next video, but that angle is very heavily forced when we plonk the hand down on the ground. Now, you might have some students that are putting the hand down on the ground and they're still very active, but again, let's look at that range of motion. Is that a functional range of motion? Is that a range of motion that improves one's health and well-being? In my experience, no. In fact, it probably does the opposite because, again, of the strain that is placed on the tendons and the ligaments when the hand is resting down, versus when we lift the hand away and we lift away from gravity and we resist that, then we get the activation to create the natural release that's required to do an extended side angle. And finally, we're going to look at a squat. Now, just depending on your students and how low they think they need to bring their hips, this seems to be a pose that people are like, I got to get low and I got to be able to, my heels are not on the ground. And there's so many rules about this, about what it means to do it properly. But what's happening is that a lot of people are not actually understanding what the benefits of this type of pose are. So if we are looking at this from the perspective of that inner thigh lengthening, then just like Goddess, just like we did with that extended side angle, we want to encourage our students to get the weight towards the outer edges of the feet. Now, you can see I'm sitting on a block here. I can easily go all the way down. However, for me, I know that there is a huge force at play on my joints because I am not in a supported position. Now, you'll see a lot of people that focus on mobility and yoga practitioners and teachers that can easily go down and easily come up, and they fully explore that range. Again, let's look at what is functional here. Now, I know it can be functional to be able to do a squat. However, given the fact that so many other parts of our bodies are not really utilized in a functional way in the yoga practice, and they're quite forced, this might not be that coveted position to be able to do that people think it is. And I have seen many more benefits come to fruition for people and myself by making this more active and not so passive. Now, there's a couple things I want to share with you about the squat. Number one, as I said, weight more to the outer edges of the feet. Now, we also can work into bringing the body a little bit more forward, which can play into some of that glute stuff. So we have got obviously multiple benefits, multiple purposes, and multiple target areas going on at once that you can encourage your students to play around with and see where things are happening for them. However, one of the best ways is to just go hands-free. What I mean when I say hands-free, I mean not letting the body drop down into a place where the flexibility is going to be forced or where it's going to be a little bit more extreme. Now, we can get our students to play with those things, but again, since the movement and the dynamic energy of a pose is going to provide more co-contraction and more natural activation of the supporting areas of the body, then it is better to create a little bit of movement and flow instead of just kind of hanging down here. But I know that so many people really want to do that. So again, you can use your discernment, your students will be able to, and you can decide what you would like to highlight and what you would like to guide them through. However, what I would encourage for the squat is to find some movement, lowering down and then coming up. Maybe even the heels lift, and there is an intention for those heels to lift. So we can use a little bit of that movement to be able to support our students. Now, if you have a student that is not able to be down in the squat and they feel like if they do anything, if they even blink their eyes, they're going to fall over, they are down way too low. As I said, a lot of times we go well beyond a range that is functional or purposeful in our everyday lives, and a lot of times this creates a lot of laxity into the joints. So get them to find a little bit more oscillation here. Weight towards the outer edges of the feet. Get them to play with that. Get them to play with even lifting a heel up and then coming up again. They can do both sides here. And this is great because if you have a student who is not able to go down, again, great, that's perfect. They can stay up, they can lift the heels, they can lower the heels. And when we do this type of active squat, your students will not be able to stay in it probably for as long as if they were in a passive squat. So yes, we can prop the body up with some blocks or bolsters in more of a passive squat. The higher, the better. But if we can give our students the chance to thread in and play with more active squat positions in the body, if that's something that they're able to do, well, then it makes sense to give them that opportunity because, again, it adds diversity, variety, it includes people, it's much more accessible in the long run because if someone is not able to just go down and up, then here is just not going to be very functional for them. So lots of different things that you can get them to play around with, and even down from this position, it could be to lift, and then it could be to drop and come forward. Obviously, this is only going to be available for certain people. Even for me, I have a little bit of knee stuff going on, and so it's not something that I can do a heap of. However, it's much more purposeful for me, and it's much more valuable than just sitting here like this. Now, when we go into the floor portion, you're going to see some of the happy baby stuff that can actually help your students find that mobility within their squat.